January 18, 1942. Snow fell in thick, lazy spirals over Kummersdorf, coating the proving grounds south of Berlin in a quiet white that muffled even the growl of engines. Inside a long, dimly lit workshop, the air smelled of oil, iron, and cigarettes. A group of German engineers stood gathered around a workbench, their breath visible in the cold air. On the table lay a captured American tank part, an awkward, square-edged piece of metal with rough weld seams and a thick layer of grease. One of the men, a tall engineer with round glasses named Otto Drexler, picked it up with a gloved hand and chuckled. "Crude," he said, turning it over. "This was built by peasants." His colleagues laughed. The youngest among them, Dietrich Hahn, joined in nervously, eager to please. Their laughter echoed against the concrete walls, mingling with the hiss of a nearby welding torch. To them, this was proof of what they already believed, that the Americans were clumsy imitators, incapable of precision. Germany, after all, was the land of fine tolerances and perfection, of Zeiss optics, Maybach engines, and machines that looked as beautiful as they functioned. The Reichsengineers had spent years chasing mathematical purity in steel, while across the ocean, factory workers used hammers where they used micrometers. Otto placed the part back on the table with a smirk and declared, "They build like farmers. Simple, stupid, and heavy. It will break the first time it fights real machinery." In that single statement was the essence of the German engineering soul. Proud, methodical, perhaps a little arrogant. But in Otto's voice, too, was something else, a trace of fear disguised as laughter. He had heard rumors from the Eastern Front. Soviet soldiers were fielding American-built trucks under the Lend-Lease program, and they were performing surprisingly well in the mud and snow. It made no sense to him. How could something so ugly, so lacking in precision, survive those conditions when German vehicles needed constant maintenance? Still, Otto pushed the thought away. Precision, he told himself, always wins. At the edge of the room, a man in a long black coat watched the laughter without joining in. His name was Franz Müller, a mechanical designer who had worked for Daimler-Benz before the war. He was older than the rest, his face lined from years spent around furnaces and blueprints. Franz was not a man of ideology, he loved machinery more than nations. He stepped closer, resting a hand on the cold steel of the table. "You're right," he said quietly, "it looks crude. But look again. See how thick the metal is? How the bolts are oversized. It's not beautiful, but it won't break easily." The laughter faded a little. Otto frowned, sensing challenge. "You admire this?" he asked. "No," Franz replied, "I respect what it's trying to do. It doesn't care about elegance, it only cares about working." Franz's words hung in the air, unwelcomed but undeniable. Even as the others dismissed him with smirks, a small seed of doubt took root. What if practicality, not perfection, decided victory? Yet no one dared voice such thoughts. The Reich demanded faith in German superiority, and doubt was a kind of treason. The men turned back to their instruments, to their sketches of Panther suspensions and turbine engines that promised dominance through complexity. Outside, the wind moaned softly against the hangar doors, carrying with it a distant sound, trains moving east, filled with soldiers and tanks, bound for a war that was already devouring steel faster than Germany could make it. Across the Atlantic, a very different scene was unfolding. In Detroit, sparks flew beneath bright electric lights. Factory floors hummed with the rhythm of conveyor belts. Men and women, some still in their teenage years, worked side by side assembling machines that looked nothing like the elegant panzers of Germany. They were boxy, loud, and almost comically plain. But they were fast to build, cheap to repair, and dependable in the mud, the cold, and the chaos of battle. The difference between the two worlds, the quiet precision of Kummersdorf and the roaring production lines of Detroit, was more than technological. It was philosophical. One sought perfection in every bolt, the other sought victory through numbers. Back in Germany, Otto was called to a late-night meeting with a military liaison officer. On the table before them lay reports from the front, damage assessments, field complaints, mechanical failures. The Tiger tank, Germany's pride, was proving powerful but temperamental. It broke down frequently, required massive logistical support, and consumed more fuel than entire truck divisions. The liaison sighed and said, "If we had fewer breakdowns, perhaps we would need fewer tanks." Otto stiffened, feeling an accusation beneath the words. He muttered something about the need for quality over quantity, but even he was beginning to see the cracks. Franz found him later, alone in the workshop, staring at a blueprint. "You're worried," Franz said. Otto didn't look up. "The Americans will flood the field," he admitted. "They can build 10 tanks for every one of ours. But their tanks are toys." Franz placed a hand on his shoulder. "Toys that keep moving when ours are in repair depots." For a moment, neither man spoke. The sound of distant artillery testing rolled through the night, like thunder behind the hills. In Berlin, Albert Speer was already drafting plans to streamline war production, alarmed by how slow Germany's factories were compared to the United States. He had studied American industrial reports before the war, impressed by Henry Ford's assembly line and the idea of interchangeable parts. Now he realized that in chasing perfection, Germany had chained itself to inefficiency. Still, it was too late to turn back. Hitler demanded masterpieces, not machines. By the spring of 1942, German intelligence began intercepting reports about American factories shifting to wartime production. Ford's Willow Run plant would soon be producing one B-24 bomber every hour. General Motors was building tanks by the hundreds. Otto read the numbers in disbelief. It was beyond comprehension. "They cannot maintain quality at that pace," he said aloud, but his voice lacked conviction. Franz, standing beside him, simply nodded toward the page. "They don't need perfection. They need enough to win." When Otto returned to Kummersdorf weeks later, he noticed something odd. A few engineers were testing captured jeeps from the North African campaign. The vehicles were dented, covered in dust, and clearly abused, but every one of them started on the first try. He watched silently as a mechanic turned the ignition and the small engine roared to life, coughing smoke but steady. A faint unease passed through him. He crouched beside the jeep and examined the engine bay. The components were simple, almost primitive, but everything was accessible, replaceable. It was engineering for endurance, not admiration. That night, Otto sat in the quiet of his office, the laughter from January echoing faintly in memory. The crude American part was still on his desk. He turned it over in his hands, feeling its weight. There was no elegance in it, no art, but it carried a strange honesty. For the first time, he wondered if they had been wrong to laugh. Outside, the searchlights swept the sky as bombers passed overhead. He thought of the thousands of machines rolling out of Detroit, of the workers hammering through the night. The war, he realized, would not be won by the most beautiful machine, but by the one that could survive the longest. He set the metal piece down and extinguished his lamp. Tomorrow, the testing would continue. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet shift had begun, a recognition that the enemy's strength was not in brilliance, but in resilience. And though he did not yet know it, the laughter of Kummersdorf had already become a ghost, fading into the cold German night. Otto dismissed him with a wave, but the words lingered. He had always believed that superiority of design would compensate for any numerical disadvantage. Yet reports from the front were beginning to tell a different story. German soldiers were encountering American Shermans in increasing numbers, not as isolated opponents, but as herds of steel, endless, coordinated, communicating through radios that worked flawlessly even under bombardment. Commanders noted that while the American tanks were easier to destroy individually, their replacements arrived before the smoke cleared. Otto read the reports with a tightening in his chest. He knew the math. Precision was priceless, but numbers had their own kind of power. Franz Müller returned from an inspection trip to the Western factories near Kassel. His mood was grim. "The supply chain is collapsing," he told Otto flatly. "Every component depends on another. We have the best craftsmen in Europe, but no raw materials to feed them. A single missing gear can delay an entire production run." He sat heavily across from Otto. Meanwhile, the Americans have built a system where if one factory falls, 10 more take its place. Otto exhaled slowly, his pride twisting into unease. "We cannot compete with madness," he said. Franz shook his head. "It isn't madness. It's organization. Back in America, organization had become a religion. President Roosevelt's "Arsenal of Democracy" speech had turned words into factories, and factories into faith. Entire cities pulsed with the rhythm of war production. Detroit became the beating heart of a nation that no longer knew peace. Farmers turned into mechanics overnight. Housewives learned to weld. The term "Rosie the Riveter" became both a symbol and a promise that America's strength was not limited to its men in uniform, but extended to every hand that could grip a tool. A war correspondent touring Willow Run described it as a living organism of steel. He wrote of a bomber taking off from the assembly line each hour, 63 minutes from rivet to runway. The precision wasn't in the machines themselves, but in the people. The workers operated as parts of a grand design, each understanding that efficiency could save lives as surely as accuracy ever had. Clara's voice was one among thousands humming beneath the roar of the engines, but together they were a song of endurance. Meanwhile, in Germany, the laughter had long since vanished from Kummersdorf. The workshops were quieter now, drained of optimism. Reports of broken transmissions, fuel shortages, and spare parts delays piled up on Otto's desk. He had begun to understand what Franz meant by organization. German production was elegant but brittle, each process too specialized, too dependent on expert craftsmanship. The Americans had replaced artisans with repeatable systems. They didn't care if one worker lacked skill because the design didn't require brilliance, only consistency. One evening, Otto received an intercepted photograph from intelligence, an aerial view of the Ford plant in Michigan. The image showed miles of roof, endless lines of cars, bombers, and trucks under assembly. A single caption read, "They build while they sleep." He stared at it for a long time before tucking it into his pocket. That night, he dreamed of machines multiplying endlessly, blotting out the map of Europe with motion and smoke. Franz found him the next morning, pale and distracted. Otto handed him the photograph without a word. Franz studied it silently, then said, "This is what fear looks like to us, and what hope looks like to them." Otto didn't answer. He was thinking of Clara Dawson, though he didn't know her name, only what she represented, the quiet defiance of those who built without glory for the sake of others. By late 1943, the Allies had gained air superiority over much of Europe. P-47 Thunderbolts and B-17s darkened the sky above German cities. The Luftwaffe could not replace its losses fast enough. Otto's engineers, desperate, began simplifying blueprints, removing decorative elements, substituting cheaper materials. It was a reluctant imitation of American pragmatism. When Franz saw the new designs, stripped of their intricate detailing, he gave a dry laugh. "We are learning humility, one shortcut at a time." Otto didn't respond. He simply stared at the modified tank design on the drafting table, a crude, simplified silhouette that reminded him uncomfortably of the part he had once mocked. Yet even as he felt the shame of imitation, he also felt a strange respect. The Americans had made engineering democratic, accessible, replicable, unstoppable. He could no longer dismiss their designs as inferior. They were, in truth, born of a philosophy that had quietly beaten his own. In December, a new report crossed Otto's desk, production estimates showing that the United States had built more tanks in that single year than Germany had in the entire war. The numbers spoke louder than pride ever could. Otto leaned back in his chair, exhausted, and said softly, "They've made simplicity into a weapon." Franz, standing beside him, nodded. "And it may be the deadliest one yet." That night, the two men walked outside the factory into the cold winter air. The sky over Germany was streaked with the faint red glow of distant bombardment. "Do you ever think," Franz said, "that perhaps we were never fighting soldiers, but factories?" Otto managed a thin smile. Factories filled with people who refused to stop. A gust of wind carried the sound of sirens from afar. They stood in silence for a while, the enormity of it settling over them. Otto looked at his hands, hands that had once held tools with confidence, now trembling slightly. "We built for glory," he murmured. "They build for endurance." Franz placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then endurance will win." The words fell softly, like ash on snow. And though neither man said it aloud, they both knew the truth. The laughter of Kummersdorf was gone forever, drowned beneath the roar of American industry that refused to sleep. By the spring of 1944, the war had entered its decisive rhythm, one of attrition, numbers, and endurance. Europe trembled under the drone of Allied bombers, a sound that now seemed endless. For Otto Drexler, each hum in the sky was an unwanted reminder that the tables had turned. What once felt like a triumphant symphony of German innovation had become a chorus of dread. The reports from the front were brutal in their consistency: tanks immobilized for lack of parts, aircraft grounded due to engine wear, and factories reduced to rubble under relentless American bombing raids. Yet even in defeat, Otto's engineers' mind refused to stop asking how. How had America, mocked for its clumsy designs and unrefined industry, managed to perfect the very machinery that now darkened his skies? At Willow Run, Clara Dawson did not think in such grand terms. She had long stopped counting the planes. Her body worked from muscle memory now, her hands knowing the rhythm of the rivet gun before her mind caught up. She had seen newsreels of the Allied advance through Italy, and she had memorized every frame that showed American soldiers smiling beside their tanks, some wearing the same insignia as her brother's division. But beneath that hope, a constant ache lingered, letters that stopped arriving. She told herself that Tom was simply moving with the front, that mail routes were slow. Yet each day that passed without word felt heavier than the machinery she helped build. One afternoon, during her break, Clara overheard two engineers discussing a captured German Panther tank recently shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground. "Thing's a marvel," one said. "Beautiful welds, top-notch optics. But you know what killed it? A single-gear tooth." The other man laughed. "All that precision, and it couldn't handle a muddy road." Clara smiled faintly, not because she found it funny, but because she understood the irony. The same precision that once symbolized German superiority had become its weakness. Too perfect to survive imperfection. In Berlin, Otto received a similar report, though the tone was far less amused. A recovered Panther from the Eastern Front had been returned for analysis. The crew reported repeated failures in the final drive after only a few days of combat. Otto read the mechanical autopsy carefully. The steel was strong, the tolerances exact, but the field conditions were unforgiving. "They designed it to impress, not to endure," Franz remarked when he visited Otto's workshop that evening. Otto sighed. "So did we." For the first time, Otto began to admire his unseen adversaries not as engineers of chaos, but as pragmatists of reality. American design, he realized, did not chase perfection, it sought functionality. Their machines were not the best, but they worked in every circumstance. They could be repaired with a wrench and some wire. His, by contrast, demanded a master craftsman and a miracle. The difference was philosophy itself. "We built for legacy," he murmured, "they build for necessity." The deeper truth dawned on him through exhaustion, not revelation. Germany's finest minds were trapped in the romance of precision, each design a monument to individual genius, not collective resilience. But across the ocean, Clara and millions like her were building not monuments, but miracles of repetition. They didn't need to understand engineering. They were engineering, the living extension of a process that never slept. Otto envied that simplicity, that faith in practicality. In March, an air raid reduced half of his facility to rubble. Franz barely escaped the fire. When the smoke cleared, Otto walked through the ruins, stepping over twisted beams and shattered drafting tables. A half-burned blueprint fluttered against his boot, a tank design, elegant and obsolete in the same instant. He picked it up and stared at it. For years, he had believed in beauty as the soul of invention. Now, surrounded by destruction, beauty felt meaningless. What mattered was survival. A week later, Otto and Franz met with a small team in a makeshift bunker beneath what remained of the research building. There, using salvage tools, they began designing something different. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't grand. It was crude, stripped of unnecessary detail. A vehicle that could be built quickly, repaired easily, and operated by anyone. "It's almost American," Franz said with a wry smile. Otto looked up from the draft. "No," he replied softly. "It's human." Their conversations grew quieter, more reflective. Franz often spoke of his son, drafted into a tank division near Normandy. Otto listened but never mentioned his own family. He had long sent them away from Berlin. He no longer spoke of victory, only of preservation, of what lessons might remain when the war inevitably ended. There was a humility in his tone now, one that would have shocked the younger version of himself. Meanwhile, the contrast across the Atlantic could not have been greater. In early May, Clara and her co-workers were informed that the plant had reached a historic milestone. The 8,000th B-24 bomber had rolled off the line. There was cheering, laughter, music, brief escapes from exhaustion. A newspaper photographer captured Clara in the background of one such celebration, her hands clasped, eyes distant. The photo appeared in the Detroit Free Press beneath the headline, "Ordinary Hands, Extraordinary Victory." She never saw it. Her thoughts were fixed on a letter she still hadn't received. Back in Berlin, Otto studied Allied leaflets that fluttered down with the raids, images of American production lines, endless as rivers. He wondered whether any of those workers ever knew the magnitude of what they built. "They fight us without hate," he said one evening to Franz. "Just determination." Franz nodded. "Maybe that's why they'll win." In June, news arrived that changed everything: the Allied invasion of Normandy. Otto heard the announcement on a static-filled radio, the calm voice of the German broadcaster masking panic beneath precision. Across the channel, America's so-called inferior designs were rolling onto the beaches: Shermans, trucks, landing craft, and bulldozers, all working in unison like parts of a vast mechanical organism. It was the final, undeniable proof of what he had come to suspect all along. America's genius was not in its machines, but in its systems. That night, Otto worked late into the hours, sketching alone by candlelight. His latest design was simple, efficient, and reparable. It was everything he once despised, and yet, for the first time in years, he felt at peace. Franz entered quietly and studied the drawing. "Would it work?" he asked. Otto smiled faintly. "It would last longer than we will." Outside, the thunder of Allied bombers filled the air again. Otto didn't flinch this time. He simply folded his hands, listening. "Do you hear it?" he said. Franz frowned. "What?" "The sound of inevitability," Otto replied. "It's what progress sounds like when it has forgotten how to stop." The next morning, Clara woke before dawn, the sunlight creeping through her factory window. She dressed in silence as always, and tied her kerchief. But something in her felt lighter. Maybe it was the radio broadcast celebrating D-Day, or maybe it was faith, fragile but real. As she walked past the assembly line, she ran her hand along the cool aluminum skin of a bomber wing and whispered, "Fly true." In Berlin, Otto stepped outside as the sirens began again. He looked toward the horizon, where black plumes rose in the distance, and for the first time, he didn't feel anger or despair, only understanding. Across an ocean, a woman he'd never meet was building what would one day pass overhead, a machine forged not from perfection but persistence. And as the sky began to rumble, Otto removed his cap and said softly, almost with reverence, "They have earned the right to be laughed at no more." Then he turned and walked back into the ruins of his workshop, ready to finish his design, if only as a final act of respect to the engineers who had beaten him by believing in imperfection. By April 1945, Berlin was a dying machine. Smoke bled through the sky like ink in water, and the once mighty hum of German industry had become a broken whisper. Streets that had once echoed with the march of certainty now lay buried under dust and silence. Otto Drexler walked through the remnants of his factory, boots crunching on shattered glass, his breath visible in the cold morning air. The smell of burnt oil and ash clung to everything. He no longer carried blueprints or tools, only a notebook filled with sketches that would never be built. What had begun as an engineer's dream of mastery had ended in rubble. He paused beside the charred frame of a tank turret, running a hand along its warped edge. "Perfection," he murmured bitterly, "was our greatest flaw." Franz Muller joined him moments later, limping from an old injury. His uniform was frayed, his eyes sunken. They're evacuating what's left of the staff to the south, he said, his voice low. They say the Soviets are only days away. Otto didn't answer. He looked at the broken machines surrounding them, their final, failed children. Tell them to go, he said at last. There's nothing left to save. Franz hesitated. And you? Otto smiled faintly. I built this place. I'll be the one to turn off the lights. Miles away, across the Atlantic, Clara Dawson stood on the edge of a crowded hangar in New York, watching rows of B-24 bombers gleaming beneath the floodlights. The war was ending, everyone could feel it. The latest dispatches spoke of Hitler trapped in his bunker, Berlin collapsing, the Reich disintegrating. Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded a telegram she'd received that morning. Her brother Tom was alive, injured but safe in France. The relief hit her in waves she could barely contain. Around her, laughter mixed with tears as other workers received similar news. For years they had labored without knowing whether their sacrifices would matter. Now, at last, the end felt real. A journalist approached her, notebook in hand. Miss Dawson, you've been here since the early days of the war, haven't you? What does victory feel like? She looked at him, eyes tired but clear. It feels like remembering what silence sounds like, she said softly. For years, we've lived by the rhythm of engines. I think I'll miss it. The reporter smiled at her answer, unaware of how much truth it carried. For Clara, the war had not been a distant story, it had been lived in metal, fire, and noise. Every rivet was a prayer whispered to an unseen brother. Now that the noise was ending, she wasn't sure who she was without it. In Berlin, the noise had returned in a different form. Artillery thundered from the outskirts of the city as Soviet shells tore through the remaining defenses. Otto and Franz took shelter in the remnants of the workshop, the concrete trembling above them. They say the Führer is still in the city, Franz muttered. Still giving orders. Otto gave a weary laugh. Then he is still pretending that orders matter. The irony was not lost on either of them. Men who had once built for the future now hiding from it. As the bombardment intensified, Otto found himself thinking of the people he had never met, those who had built the machines that now encircled his city. He imagined Clara Dawson without knowing her name, imagined the rhythm of her work, the hum of her factory, the steady hands that built the wings of the planes now roaring above him. The thought did not anger him. In an odd way, it comforted him. We laughed at them once, he said quietly, because we mistook simplicity for stupidity. But simplicity is what endures. Franz looked at him, confused. You sound almost proud. Otto nodded. I am. Proud to have been beaten by such a kind of wisdom. That night, a bomb struck the far end of the complex, throwing both men to the ground. Dust and debris filled the air. When Franz regained his breath, he found Otto pinned beneath a collapsed beam. He tried to move it, but Otto stopped him. No, he said, voice weak but steady. It's all right. Franz knelt beside him, desperate. We can still, Otto shook his head. Listen, he whispered. The distant sound of engines rolled through the night, the low drone of American bombers passing overhead toward the Eastern Front. That sound, Otto said with a faint smile, that's what victory sounds like when it belongs to someone else. Franz gripped his friend's hand. You don't have to die here. Otto's eyes flickered with the last light of stubborn dignity. I built for a world that no longer exists. But I hope they build something better. The beam shifted slightly, a groan of metal. Otto's breath grew shallow. When you see the end, he said, make sure you learn from it. Franz wanted to speak, but his voice broke. Learn what? Otto's lips curved in a final, almost gentle smile. That no empire falls because it is weak, but because it forgets how to adapt. By dawn, the Soviets had entered the outskirts. Franz escaped with a small group of survivors, carrying Otto's notebook, the last record of a man who had once believed that machines could define a nation. He didn't look back. Behind him, the city burned like a foundry consuming its own creations. Across the sea, Clara stood on a quiet airfield, watching one final bomber take flight. Its engines roared to life, cutting through the morning mist. She thought of all the men and women whose hands had shaped it, all the invisible stories folded into its steel. "We built for them," she whispered. For the first time in years, she smiled without exhaustion. Weeks later, the war ended. The headlines screamed of surrender, of celebration, of peace reborn from ashes. But in the quiet corners of factories and bombed-out cities, another kind of victory settled in, one not of nations but of endurance. Claire returned home to Ohio, to her brother, to silence. She took a job teaching again, though her hands still bore faint scars from years of labor. Sometimes, when the wind rattled the windows, she swore she could still hear the steady pulse of the assembly line, like a heartbeat from another life. Franz, meanwhile, lived through the ruins of Reconstruction. He worked as a mechanic in Munich, repairing tractors instead of tanks. On quiet evenings, he opened Otto's notebook and studied the sketches, simple, functional machines, designed not for conquest but survival. One night, he found a note scribbled in the margin beside a drawing of a crude vehicle. "Strength lies not in perfection, but in persistence." He stared at the words for a long time, then closed the book gently. "You were right, old friend," he said aloud. Years passed. The world rebuilt itself, this time slower, wiser. In America, the factories returned to peacetime production. Willow Run began producing automobiles once more, the noise of war replaced by the hum of peace. Clara occasionally received letters from fellow workers, sharing stories of marriages, new jobs, and children who had grown up without ever hearing an air raid siren. Yet even in peace, she carried the same quiet pride, the knowledge that ordinary people had once achieved the impossible. In Germany, Franz grew old surrounded by fields instead of furnaces. When he died, his daughter found Otto's notebook on his bedside table. She sent it to a museum in Munich, where curators puzzled over its contents, half-burned blueprints and a few cryptic notes. They displayed it beneath glass, labeled simply, "Recovered sketches of an unknown engineer, 1945. Evidence of changing philosophy in wartime design." Visitors passed it without much notice, unaware that within those fragile pages lay the bridge between two worlds, one that built for glory and one that built for endurance. And so, history closed its chapter on the laughter of Kummersdorf and the roar of Willow Run. In the end, it wasn't brilliance that decided the war, but the quiet, stubborn rhythm of persistence, the belief that imperfection, multiplied 1,000,000 times, could outlast perfection itself. As the narrator's voice would say, had this been a film, they laughed at American designs once. But when the smoke cleared, the laughter was gone, and the world that followed was built by the ones who refused to stop. If you like this story, remember to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. History, after all, belongs to those who remember.